So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first ever dialogue and the first ever virtual bilateral dialogue between the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses and the Asia Research Center, Center for Security Studies, Warsaw, the War Studies University of Warsaw. The topic today is emerging security complex in Afghanistan, perspectives from India and Poland. We have a very good lineup of speakers. I will deliver a few opening remarks and then request Mr. Thomas Deptula, Director of the War Studies University, to also deliver his opening remarks. And thereafter, we will have special remarks by both the ambassadors, Ambassador of India to Poland and the Ambassador of Poland to India. And then we will go into session one, which is the main session where we will have our experts speak. I will introduce them as we go along. But a few housekeeping chores here. Firstly, that may I request all non-speakers to keep their microphones on mute mode all the time. It's only when they take the floor that they might unmute themselves. Secondly, that I request all our participants, and I can see in all about 45, that includes, of course, the panelists, which number 10. So therefore, there are 35 other people listening in. And should they have some questions, may I request them to kindly pose them in the Q&A box at the bottom right of your screen, past the chat box. I will not be looking into the chat box. I will be looking into the Q&A box. And please keep your questions brief and to the point. And also please identify the participant or panelist to whom that particular question is directed. So with this having been said, may I now move on to making my own opening remarks. Let me begin by firstly acknowledging the presence of my counterpart, Mr. Thomas Deptula, Ambassador Nagma Malik, and Ambassador Adam Burakovsky. Thank you for joining us. And thank you also to the experts from the Asia Research Center and other guests and participants who have found time to be with us this afternoon. I extend a very warm welcome to all of you. Today, as I mentioned earlier, we have gathered for the first ever bilateral dialogue, albeit in virtual form. And I must add that Polish scholars have been to our institute in the past, but we hope to see them again physically when we have better times and when COVID is but a distant memory. Hopefully that day will come in the near future. The virtual medium thrust upon us today by the pandemic has actually made engagements relatively easier to implement and to execute. And we therefore have, I think, in a most timely manner, organized this first ever virtual seminar between our two sides. We should make full use of this opportunity and also promise ourselves that we will interact regularly in the future as well. Friends, India and Poland share a long-standing friendly relationship marked by high-level political contacts, and we also have a vibrant economic partnership and some traditional cultural linkages. A few months ago, Ambassador Burakovsky visited me in my office, and we immediately began to recall the great connection between the Jam Sahib of Navanagar, that is Jamnagar in Gujarat, in Saurashtra. In fact, the region from where I come from is the Rajkot Jamnagar belt. And we were talking about Sri Digvijay Singhji, the Jam Sahib, and his ties to Poland. As you all know, the Jam Sahib, who was the ruler of the princely state of Navanagar, had very generously given refuge to 1,000 Polish children who were fleeing the Holocaust in Europe. And he had built a school for them at Balachadi on the seashore, which is today the Sainik School Balachadi. And he gave them many years of love, care, and affection and education. And today the children are, I dare say, all of them octogenarians, but they haven't quite forgotten the good deeds of the Maharaja. And so it's no wonder that there is a school in Warsaw named after him, and also a square that is known as the Good Maharaja Square in Warsaw. And that is how we fondly recall the memory of the Maharaja and his ties to Poland. This story strikes a special emotive chord in me, since my mother, at a personal level, I might inform you, hailed from Jamnagar, as in hailed from Navanagar, and was also considered a goddaughter by the Maharaja. And I too benefited from the Maharaja's generosity in 1965, when he quite ensured that I was admitted to the Rajkumar College in Rajkot, his own alma mater. Admissions were very difficult, and a word had to be put in by no less than the Jam Sahib himself. And lo and behold, the doors were open to me. Over the last few years, our bilateral relations have been transformed through frequent high-level visits. Our partnership is multifaceted and multidimensional. We continue to add more pillars to our bilateral ties by deepening cooperation in the social, strategic, and economic fields. But all around us, friends, the world is experiencing major geostrategic and geo-economic shifts. And already fragile international compact has been weakened by the COVID-19 pandemic. Economic recovery is a priority both for India and for Poland. Redesigning new resilient supply chains in order to prevent future disruptions has emerged as a major and also a common challenge. At the geopolitical level, the rise of China poses a strategic challenge. This is the third time in recent history that the People's Republic of China is redefining its position in the world. The first was when the Communist Party of China came to power in 1949. The second, when the People's Republic of China was admitted to the United Nations as a permanent member in 1971. And the third major shift is the current moment when China's unilateralism, aggression, its revanchism is impacting on global governance and developmental narratives everywhere. Its territorial ambitions have reverberated from the East China Sea to the South China Sea, all the way to Ladakh in the Himalayas. In Europe, the broad economic and political consensus in place for decades has cracked. China is a clear factor in dividing the house, but so is Russia. And the economic issues that the EU faces are also contributing to differences. Following Brexit, Britain has chosen to plow its own furrow with global Britain and an explicit tilt towards the Indo-Pacific. The pendulum of US policy towards Europe has stabilized under President Biden, which is a clear acknowledgement of the importance of the transatlantic partnership, particularly at this juncture. In our part of the world, the specter of terrorism continues to haunt the region. Pakistan remains committed to the use of terrorism as part of its toolkit in dealing with neighbors, particularly India. It is also clear that the Taliban are here to stay in Afghanistan. This has security implications for India and the region at large. A spillover of any chaos and instability in Afghanistan beyond its borders could give terrorism a shot in the arm. Radical groups, militants, and terrorists everywhere will undoubtedly be emboldened. Many will reactivate their safe havens in Afghanistan. The great irony is that the Taliban, until recently themselves seen as terrorists, are now being mainstreamed in the global community by not just Pakistan, but also by their erstwhile foes. Taliban leaders with bounties on their heads, such as members of the Haqqani network, are now heading ministries and seek to travel freely as representatives of the people of Afghanistan. The bigger irony is the rise of the Islamic State Khorasan, ISK, which has swapped roles with the erstwhile Taliban in leading terrorist attacks on innocent minorities in places ranging from Kandahar to Kunduz, and also targeting, ironically, the Taliban regime itself. The most urgent task before the global community is two-pronged. Firstly, there is urgent need to ensure the provision of humanitarian assistance in an open and transparent manner. Secondly, there is a pressing need to check the excesses committed by zealots and criminals in Afghanistan, including from among the Taliban regime, on vulnerable sections of society. Thirdly, the international community needs to ensure that Afghanistan's territory is not used as a staging ground by terrorist and radical groups to disrupt peace and security in the region. Many of these, as you well know, have been expressed in discussions in the UN Security Council in the month of August, when India held the rotating presidency. UN Security Council 2593, adopted on 30 August, covers these priorities. For India, the situation in Afghanistan has major implications. The threat of a spillover of malevolence radiating out of Afghanistan into Kashmir cannot be taken lightly by us. And we are determined to break the back of Pakistan-sponsored terrorism with our policy of zero tolerance. The priority for India is to preserve the goodwill earned by India among the people of Afghanistan over the years through capacity building and high impact development projects at the cost of billions of dollars. This was reflected in Prime Minister Narendra Modi's remarks at the G20 summit, in which he alluded to the friendship that the people of Afghanistan have for India. The Indian Prime Minister, mind you, has also unequivocally indicated India's readiness to deliver humanitarian assistance to Afghan friends in an unhindered manner. Discussions are ongoing for securing unfettered access to Afghanistan through Pakistan for India's wheat shipments. We are also looking at ways to ameliorate the hardships of more than 2,300 Afghan students who are stranded in India as a result of the sudden regime change. Prime Minister Modi has given fresh impetus to the regional dialogue and efforts to build lasting peace and security in Afghanistan. Recently, the National Security Advisor of India also held a meeting at the level of the NSAs of the region. While receiving the National Security Advisors attending that third regional security dialogue on Afghanistan in Delhi, the Prime Minister succinctly outlined 4 key aspects that require focus. The need for inclusive government in Afghanistan, a zero tolerance position about Afghan territory being used by terrorist groups, a strategy to counter drugs and arms trafficking from Afghanistan, and lastly, addressing the increasingly critical humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. Friends, India and Poland have a shared interest in tackling the challenges emanating from Afghanistan. Notwithstanding the fact that we are in 2 different parts of the world. Poland too has made great efforts and sacrifices over the past 2 decades to contribute to peace and security through its participation in the NATO-led forces in Afghanistan. So with these words, I now request my counterpart, Mr. Thomas Deptula, Director, Center for Security Studies, War Studies, University of Poland, to kindly deliver his opening remarks. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I will not give long remarks because my area of expertise is more Atlantic-oriented than Asia-oriented. However, I would like to express my gratitude to Your Excellencies ambassadors for participating in this event, and to everyone who helped organize this webinar. I think that in age of a pandemic, when we cannot meet face to face, this kind of exchange of view is extremely important. I hope this webinar will broaden our knowledge of a part of the world which is geographically much closer to India. However, it's very important for the security of Poland. So, without delaying, I would like to give the floor to our ambassadors and then to our experts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deptula. And I now request our ambassador to Poland, Her Excellency Nagma Mohammed Malik, to kindly deliver her special remarks. Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Ambassador Chinoy. Ambassador Sujan Chinoy, Mr. Tomasz Deptula, Ambassador Burakovsky, and friends. It is for me a pleasure to be here as part of this very erudite gathering of people who have the time ahead today to discuss something that is a complex but essential matter to be discussed by the international community. I want to begin. Clearly, I'm not an expert on Afghanistan, and I'm here. Most of my remarks will be about the India-Poland relationship, but I will speak a little bit about various aspects of this relationship and a little on Afghanistan too. I wish to begin by thanking Ambassador Sudhanshu Rai for that little roundup he gave on this important historic link between Jamnagar and Poland. And I want to, if I may, add a small correction, not small correction, an important correction, which I hope that you, Ambassador Chinoy, and the others here, of course, many others here know it already, but I do feel it important to mention it. For reasons that must be to do with the magnetic personality of the Maharaja Digvijay Singh Ji, somehow the fame and the credit for having provided refuge to Polish refugees in the Second World War has devolved upon him solely in the public consciousness. But as a matter of fact, in point of fact, the royal family of Kolhapur in Maharashtra also provided refuge to many larger numbers, over 5,000 refugees, adults and children, in their refugee camp that they set up specially for the Polish refugees in a place called Varivadi. So this Varivadi camp had these large numbers of people who were there, and the royal family, I think the royal family lacked a charismatic figure like Maharaja Digvijay Singh Ji, but certainly there is no doubt about it that here in Poland, Maharaja Digvijay Singh Ji is very well known. Ambassador mentioned the Good Maharaja School. There are a series of them. There are 8 of them, not just one. One is right opposite me. I can see it right now opposite the embassy. And they, by a vote, they decided that the vote was between two Polish heroes and this Polish hero, the Maharaja. And by a popular vote, it was decided that they would make the patron of the school the Maharaja. Maharaja of the Jam Sahab of Navanagar. So this is another aspect. It was 2 separate royal families which provided this assistance, and with large numbers. But I can assure you, all my Indian friends and Polish friends, the Polish people and the government are very cognizant of this link, and it is indeed something that anchors our relationship. Poland and India have excellent ties that go back decades, and we have very good economic ties. There is a $3 billion and growing investment from India into Poland, mostly in the areas of IT, majors, pharmaceuticals, and textiles. There is also a significant Polish investment into India in sanitary products, in textiles, in a variety of sectors. The bilateral trade turnover between our 2 countries is also around $3 billion. It was growing steadily, but force majeure, the pandemic intervened, and since 2020, of course, those figures have gone down and most likely will be affected in the future too. It was becoming clear that we are coming out of it. It is today, I think, no longer so very clear. But the important thing is that both our economies have shown resilience, and we have been able to come out of this, this pandemic-induced lockdown and the slowing down of economic activities well. I have had the good fortune to be able to visit in the past few days the Polish ports of Szczecin and Świnoujście, and thereafter the economically important city of Wrocław. And I have seen for myself the Polish economic machine doing very well indeed. It is in fact one of the few countries in the world that have shown an upward graph in the GDP growth from 1991 onwards, without being affected by the 2008 recession. Both our countries have attempted to, as Ambassador Chinoy mentioned, have tried to help Afghanistan in her development, India especially as a close neighbor. We have invested greatly in the human resources of Afghanistan. We have provided educational opportunities, trading and economic opportunities to the Afghan people. And there are many who have made their home in India for the purpose of studying or for the purpose of medical treatment. And that is something that India is proud of doing, and India has a long tradition of doing this. The current situation of looming humanitarian disaster in Afghanistan is indeed of utmost concern, along with ensuring that Afghanistan does not again become a breeding ground for terrorism. The international community and our 2 governments must do everything that it possibly can to rise above political positions and to ensure that large numbers of people do not starve or die in the cold in the months ahead, which are crucial. India has provided citizenship to many Afghan refugees who sought it, and so has Poland. I have seen the figures just this morning that I think over 500 Afghan nationals have been given citizenship by the Polish government. I want to just finish here by saying there is much I can say, of course, on our bilateral relationship, but considering the focus of this virtual meet, I will just speak a little bit on. I will end just by speaking a little bit on the excellent bilateral defense cooperation that India and Poland have traditionally had. This cooperation has proceeded in fits and starts, which I think is a characteristic perhaps of the kind of defense cooperation which depends upon import or exports of equipment. But of recent years, it is clear that we need to re-energize this tie. I read with some concern just yesterday that the famous Polish producer Boomer Labedi may actually cease production this year. This is a company that has a very good record of making and supplying armored vehicles to the region and to India. We worked with them. We were associated with them in a few years ago for the modernization of our tanks, of our armored vehicle recovery vehicles, and in a variety of such armored vehicle equipment sourcing. We worked with this company, and I sincerely hope that they do not close down and that some way can be found for them to be rejuvenated and given a new lease of life. The Indian government has, I think I should mention here, recently relaxed the FDI limits from 49% to 74% for foreign investment in our defense industry. I invite Polish producers to take advantage of this opening. Let us not lose our established strengths and strengths that have brought us closer together in the past, and I think can do so in the future. With this, I will end here. I know that there are many more people who will speak more to the topic, and I wait to hear from them. Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Nagma Malik, for your remarks and for outlining the overall picture of our bilateral relations. And I'm glad that you also found it appropriate to mention the defense partnership, which we must do more to augment in diverse ways. I now invite His Excellency Adam Borakowski, Ambassador of Poland to India, to kindly deliver his special remarks. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to be here at this first virtual bilateral dialogue, Emerging Security Complex in Afghanistan, Perspectives from India and Poland, that is organized between the War Studies in Warsaw and the IDSA in Delhi. As Ambassador Sujan Chinoy said, we met like a few months ago, and we discussed this cooperation. We discussed many things. We discussed also the Jamnagar story. If I may add to what my counterpart and dear friend Ambassador Nagma Malik said about the school. I am the graduate of the Maharaja School in Warsaw. I voted for his name, so myself. So it is a very good connection, and I would like to visit Jamnagar once again, and also Rajkot. Thank you for this invitation that you, Ambassador Chinoy, addressed to me when we met. So I'm very glad that this discussion takes place. Poland and India have been working together almost for 20 years to maintain and keep the peace and stability in Afghanistan. Poland, as a part of NATO, contributed very much to this project, both in the ISAF mission and then in the Resolute Support mission. We unfortunately lost 43 of our soldiers and 1 medical rescuer. So 44 casualties in total. We committed also in development projects, especially in the Ghazni province, which was our PRT. Me, myself, I visited Afghanistan many times, and I also met with the key players of that time. The fall of Kabul, which happened in August this year, was a very sad surprise for Poland, as for every other country, every democratic country in the world. I know that it was also a sad surprise for India. Just after the fall of Kabul, Poland conducted a major scale evacuation of Afghan nationals from Kabul. We evacuated 1,300 Afghans that before helped us in our military mission and also in the civil projects, and also they worked along with Polish NGOs and journalists. We also helped to evacuate some other Afghans who participated in some NATO projects that worked with some other allied countries like Lithuania, Netherlands, and also we evacuated part of the personnel of the EU delegation. We, of course, evacuated the whole local staff of the former embassy of Poland in Kabul, along with their families. So this was our last contribution to Afghanistan in this moment. Now we are observing the situation. We would like to provide humanitarian aid, but we have to be secure that this humanitarian aid really ends up to those in need and not to this Taliban regime. So this is the situation that we are now in. We are observing what our friends and partners from the European Union are doing. We are in close contact with both the EU delegation and other European missions accredited to Afghanistan. As part of them are in Doha, a part of them operate from their respective countries. So we are really concerned what is going on. We unfortunately expect some big humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, and we really want to continue contributing to peace and stability of Afghanistan and to welfare of Afghan people. And we see India as a natural ally in this context. Me, myself, I'm accredited to Afghanistan. I presented my credentials to President Ghani, the one who left Kabul in August. I met many officials there, as I said, also our soldiers. I visited many times. So I'm really also concerned what is happening there. I hope that in some moment in time, the democracy and the peace will return to that country, which is our friendly country for almost 100 years. The diplomatic ties between Poland and Afghanistan were established in 1927. And there is also one personal tie that ties Poland, India, and Afghanistan. This is the person of Mr. Tahir Kadiri, who has been who served as a head of mission in Delhi, and then he moved to Warsaw as ambassador, and he's still ambassador of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan in Warsaw. So thank you very much for this invitation. I wish you a very fruitful discussion, and not to take much more time of yours. Thank you and good luck. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your remarks and for drawing out some of these, historical snippets also that unite us. Friends, we have now concluded the opening inaugural session, and we move into the substantive session now, which is on emerging security complex in Afghanistan, perspectives from both India and Poland. The chair, as you all know, should be more seen than heard, and therefore I have every intention of restricting myself to simply introducing the speakers and calling upon them to make their remarks. I did cover what I had to say in my opening remarks. Our first speaker is Mr. Vishal Chandra, a research fellow at our institute. Mr. Vishal Chandra has traveled widely in Afghanistan and has participated in a number of academic and track 2 fora over the years. He's been with us at the IDSA for many years, since 2003, and is currently part of the South Asia Center at the Institute. Mr. Vishal Chandra, I now request you to kindly take the floor and make your presentation. You have 15 minutes. Please do make full use of that time. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Hope I'm audible, sir.
Yes, please continue. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you for the opportunity to share my views, my personal views and observations on the situation in Afghanistan. Ladies and gentlemen, as we all know, Afghanistan has come full circle. We are looking at a country, a society that has witnessed several rounds of violent social and political upheavals, including 2 armed interventions from outside in the last 4 decades, involving almost 3 generations of Afghan people, either sides of the divide. So Afghanistan has emerged, as very rightly pointed out by the Director General, as a complex and a multi-dimensional, rather a multi-generational, I would add to it, challenge right at the heart of Asia. Now, talking about Taliban also means talking about the Haqqani network, which exercises disproportionately large influence as far as the Taliban caretaker government in Kabul is concerned. And similarly, we also need to take into account the role of Pakistani and other jihadi groups which are active in Afghanistan. And to this, one can add the pro-Taliban, not only the Haqqani network, but also international terrorist networks like Al-Qaeda. Now, there is a wait and watch scenario here, because we still need to see to what extent the current political setup, the caretaker Taliban government would be able to get down to the basics of governance, to the basics of economics and economy, and to the basics of international politics. Similarly, to what extent they would be able to reconcile to the social or political diversity of the country. That is again something that still remains to be seen. And that's something they had assured the international community, that they will form an inclusive Islamic government. So the big question here is, can Taliban govern? Because they would be requiring billions of dollars of aid and assistance. So they need to create conducive environment for foreign investments and sustain humanitarian aid and assistance. Now that's a big question, again, with no clear answers. So far, Taliban have been united or unified in war, but they now appear divided in power. And as far as the ideology is concerned, I don't think there's any notable shift in the ideology at the moment. And the ideology was never meant to be a unifying ideology, one that cuts across Afghan ethnicities. I'll come to that later. So overall, the idea of emirate, in my opinion, simply never had the kind of appeal that is required to unify the Afghan nation. Now, whether Taliban would be able to transform their, their structures or their thought process, or ideologically, will they be adjusting to the contemporary realities of Afghanistan and the region? that again, so there are a lot of questions to which there may not be very clear answers. So we'll have to wait and watch as they, expand their influence within the country and try and set up administration at different levels. Now, Taliban, again, this may be slightly early to make such a projection, but then that is my assessment that Taliban, as we know today, based on my understanding of Afghan history, and particularly the history of the Afghan wars, I think Taliban, as we know today, may not be there in their current form in times to come, or groups within and without might realign or morph into something else, opening an altogether new, or rather familiar chapter of alliance politics and resource competition in and around Afghanistan. I would also like to make an observation right at the beginning of my presentation that Taliban is not Afghanistan. Afghanistan as a geocultural space is much larger and too diverse to be any country's strategic backyard. Similarly, it is too much for any over-centralized authoritarian structure in Kabul to sustain its monopoly over power dynamics at the subnational levels for far too long. As very rightly brought out by my Director General, that the return of the Taliban to power and the emergence of Islamic State Khorasan as a key armed opposition group, well, it is fast emerging, rapidly emerging as a platform also to challenge the Taliban regime. It threatens to complicate the overall security scenario when one looks at Daesh or the Islamic State Khorasan along with Al-Qaeda, because both seem to be competing to expand their influence and control over other regional militant groups or networks that have been active in the region. And there are unverified reports suggesting that members of the erstwhile Afghan National Army and police who are being hunted down by the Taliban, usually underreported, could be swelling the ranks of the Islamic State. And there are statements coming from the senior UN officials, UN Special Representative to Afghanistan, that Islamic State appears to have presence in almost all the provinces now. So the unfolding game is bound to have consequences for the region, foreseen and unforeseen, as some old and cold calculations continue to stare geopolitics in and around heart of Asia. Well, if one looks at the various peace processes, well, no one is talking about it anymore for very valid reasons, but one of the issues that remain largely unaddressed, and I feel is very critical when one is looking at the situation in Afghanistan, and that is the role of Pakistani sponsored actors inside Afghanistan, or the role of Pakistan's military establishment in terms of sustaining those very structures, support structures that have been responsible for social political turmoil or spread of extremism in Afghanistan and around Afghanistan. Even the February 2020 US Taliban agreement, which had a very limited agenda, somewhere remained notably indifferent, I would say, to the future as much to the past of the 4-decade-old conflict in Afghanistan. Now, with structures remaining very much across the east of the Durand line intact, so I have a, as per my understanding of the security complex in the region, there are chances, as I stated earlier, of sections of Taliban morphing into something else, or them being replaced by another group in times to come under a different flag and a different name. Now, we also need to take into account two facts here when we are looking at the security situation, particularly along the Durand line, which is the tribal areas on the Pakistani side and the provinces that are largely under the control of the Haqqani network, since Haqqanis are now heading the Interior Ministry, Sirajuddin Haqqani. And interestingly, the Haqqanis were integrated into the Taliban political structures back in 2016. That was when it was very clear that the previous American president, was not very keen on extending the military mission in Afghanistan. So Pakistan had been preparing to push them into Afghanistan. Several of these foreign militant groups to take the international pressure off. And this process started back in 2014. I'm sure you remember that Operation Zarbe-Azb was launched around middle of 2014. And one of the outcomes of the Operation Zarbe-Azb launched by the Pakistan Army in North Waziristan and the neighboring tribal agencies was to push these foreign militants inside Afghanistan. And a couple of years later, we had reports coming in from the Afghan sources and international sources that there are over 10,000 foreign militants living in areas along with their family members, even in areas which were traditionally considered stable or peaceful in northern Afghanistan. So Operation Zarbe-Azb, I think, was well timed by the Pakistanis, timed in the sense that it was launched at a time when the Western forces were vacating their forward operating bases, when they were ending their combat mission, and the Daesh was on the rise in parts of Afghanistan. Now, most of the, let me try and broaden the canvas very quickly, the regional canvas. Now, most of the regional or neighboring countries, as you're aware, they had reached out to the Taliban leadership, or let's say the Taliban representatives, to be more precise, representatives and negotiators based in Doha. Now, we have been hearing all these months and even in the run-up to the February 2020 agreement that Taliban have been saying that they are not going to allow Afghan soil to be used by other militant groups against any other country. Now, what Taliban had been seeking all through was a very transactional kind of a relationship, because they were clearly sensing victory, and they have been selling this idea of giving security, assuring security to the neighbors, starting with the United States. That is what February 2020 agreement was all about. So some of these regional countries, they did try to buy security from the Taliban, and it's an irony that the group that is banned in many of the regional countries, was found offering security to them. So that again brings out the dilemma, of dealing with a network, as brought out earlier by Director General. Because there is no way one can continue to sustain engagement with Afghanistan unless Taliban changes its policies or at some stage, earns some kind of a formal recognition. So that is something to be seen later, and much would depend on their actions on the ground. At least there is a consensus both at the regional and the broader international level on the idea of Taliban walking the talk. So that is something again remains to be seen. Taliban on their part, well, they have been very diplomatic in the sense that they have so far avoided entangling themselves into regional conflicts. They have avoided issuing controversial statements, and that explains the fact that they have pursued a policy of transactional engagement as far as neighborhood is concerned. Now, well, the Islamic Emirate, as we all know, is back with its patently old and familiar tendencies to monopolize and over-centralize power and impose their worldview, their interpretation and understanding of religious traditions and laws on a society that is inherently diverse, pluralistic in so many ways.
You have 3 more minutes.
Okay, sir. So it is no surprise that the people of Afghanistan belonging to different ethnicities or speaking different languages, are not at the center of the Taliban thought process. Well, Taliban leaders and fighters, mostly schooled and nurtured in state-sponsored and financed Pakistani Deobandi madrasas that came up in the 80s and 90s, have been very clear about their political and social objectives. But at the same time, let me quickly try and take a more nuanced view of the Taliban in 2021. Now, just as a new generation of Afghan youth had emerged post-2001, benefited from the international engagement, similarly, a new generation of fighters have emerged. So this whole idea of an inclusive Islamic government is something which may be very difficult for the sections of the older leadership, which may have realized the value of diplomacy, strategic communication, to sell this idea to the younger and the more uncompromising lot. Well, for now, Taliban seem to, somewhere they are seeking international recognition, which means they do not want to suffer from international isolation, because that was one of the most frustrating factors for them back in the 90s. But at the same time, making various sections of Taliban, including the Haqqani network, agree to the very idea of sharing power or having a more inclusive or representative government is something which could be, which seems to be affecting the internal cohesion of the Taliban group at the moment. So whichever scenario one looks at, it is logically impossible to think of a stable and peaceful Afghanistan anytime in the near future. Now, as far as India is concerned, as a key stakeholder, as a key partner in the stability and development of Afghanistan last 2 decades, and as an immediate and friendly neighbor of Afghan people, well, India is taking a nuanced and a long-term view of the emerging scenario in Afghanistan. And I think in this regard, and as is evident from India's participation in various regional forums and its own efforts, very recent efforts, to try and bring all the regional countries together, though China and Pakistan, as I have indicated in my presentation, continue to pursue, go by their old and cold calculations of the past, didn't participate, but nevertheless, attempts are on to complement other regional efforts at the same time by India. So I think India is willing to contribute to any regional or international initiative that seeks to facilitate a broad-based, inclusive and sustained political process in the country, one that is sensitive to the aspirations of the Afghan people, one that is sensitive to the diversity of Afghanistan, and one that is recognized by the United Nations. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your kind attention.
Thank you, Mr. Vishal Chandra, and thank you also for sticking to the time allotted to you. I now request Mr. Lezinski of the Asia Research Center in the War Studies University to kindly deliver his remarks. You have 15 minutes, like the previous speaker. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and I would like also to thank my co-panelist, Vishal Chandra, for his insightful presentations. Thank you. I would like to divide my speech into 2 parts. I'd like to first point a few points regarding recent Afghanistan crisis from European perspective, and in second, if I will still have time, I will speak about our view on future Chinese and Russian involvement in Afghanistan. So I will start with our unique European perspective on Afghanistan crisis. Firstly, I would like to move back in time a little to the decision-making process regarding withdrawal of all foreign forces, not only US forces. For years, European members of NATO participated in Afghanistan mission. There were not as many troops from Europe as from the United States, of course, but their participation was still very significant. After the signing of the so-called peace agreement between the Taliban and the United States, President Trump's administration didn't consult the next steps with its European allies, but only announced the next steps to them. The whole process of forces withdrawal was supposed to be condition-based. Conditions, of course, regarding to the security situation. But as it happened, with worsening of security situation, the US went along with it, and the military contingent in Afghanistan was further reduced. Europe held back a little with its decisions, with its decisions, waiting for the results of American presidential elections. But anyway, it was already decided. After the presidential elections in US, there was hope that the decisions by the United States will change, and to some extent it did. Consultations took place, but in the end, the new president decided to stick with the former administration's decision to completely withdraw all the foreign forces. The final date was postponed by 5 months until the beginning of September. European countries did it even faster within 2.5 months, and by the end of June, only the American troops remained in Afghanistan, and their withdrawal was already on the way. The fall of Islamic Republic 2 months later showed that US approach led to a PR catastrophe that could be avoided, presumably. What was also important from European perspective is that events that followed the fall of Kabul and happened on Kabul airport showed that European countries don't have the ability to evacuate its citizens and Afghans who worked for them without US help. It is worth mentioning that only France was prepared for the quick fall of the Ghani's administration. It began evacuation of above-mentioned groups 5 months earlier, I think it was in March. I will not dwell on the common European military abilities because it is not my area of expertise, but this is an important matter that could move ahead the discussion about future common European army. So the whole process of leaving the Afghanistan could be described as a mess. What is more important is the fact that Europe will be much more affected by the consequences of this mess than the United States. There are 3 main threats that could and probably would emanate from Afghanistan. First threat to Europe is the flow of refugees caused by current living conditions in this country and fear from the repeat of 2015 events. It was a very big refugee crisis. What we are now seeing in Afghanistan is humanitarian crisis in the making. International Monetary Fund, IMF, predicts that Afghan GDP in 2021 will shrink by 30%, given the fact that even before the fall of previous administration in Kabul, level of poverty was close to 60% or even higher, according to some estimates. One can only imagine what will happen next. The two main causes of this are withdrawal of all the foreign funds, which were responsible for about 30% of Afghan GDP, and another cause is that international sanctions regime against the Taliban are still in place. So because they are still considered as a terrorist, so as a terrorist group. So both these causes still affect the situation in Afghanistan. According to some sources, in October, between 4,000 and 6,000 Afghans crossed the border with Iran on a daily basis. So if these numbers reflect reality, the wave of refugees has already started. Europe will try to prevent the humanitarian catastrophe from happening. And we saw that in the last few weeks, European Union promised 1 billion euro of humanitarian aid, and Germany another 600 million. But as I understand, this money right now can't be spent easily because of the sanctions against the Taliban regime. So my take is what we'll probably see in the upcoming weeks is some kind of sanctions relief to bring this money to Afghanistan and allow international aid organizations to function inside the country. If it won't happen, humanitarian catastrophe will take place, and the scenes which we saw at the Kabul airport in the last few weeks of August will be nothing comparing to the hunger afflicting millions of Afghans. The second threat, which my co-panelists already mentioned, this will be the third threat, of course. Second threat is also connected with current economic situation, drug production and smuggling, drug smuggling. We can also expect that higher supply of drugs from Afghanistan. I mean, heroin, opiates, and methamphetamine. Firstly, labor will probably be cheaper than before, which constitutes significant part of the production cost. Second, some taxes of the whole process of making and transporting drugs are gone due to the fall of President Ghani administrations and some warlords along with it. And third is the necessity. Given the harsh economic situation and weather conditions, one can expect that Afghan will turn to easier and more profitable crops. And again, humanitarian aid and diplomatic engagement. It is worth mentioning, of course, that some European countries are already planning to reopen their embassies. And this diplomatic engagement and humanitarian aid seems to be the only solution to mitigate the drug threat from Afghanistan. Third threat is international terrorism, like my co-panelist already said. Although the Taliban are actively fighting SKP, the local branch of Islamic State, and are trying to eliminate this threat, which is also a danger for them, there are other terrorist groups that are still linked to the Taliban. The greatest example is Al-Qaeda, which has a history of organizing attacks in Europe. In this matter, goals of regional and Western countries align even more, so one can expect combined efforts to mitigate this threat. So that was the main points. That were the main points of my take on a European perspective regarding Afghanistan. In the second part of my presentation, I would like to give some of my thoughts on the future Russia and China's role in Afghanistan. Both of these countries has maintained relations with the Taliban for years. It has been some time that they had accepted the fact that the Taliban will be part of the future governments. So as we can see, they were not wrong, although not in the way that they wanted, because these countries in the past tried to bring Kabul and the Taliban representatives together and hold so-called peace talks. China did it in 2015 and 2016 with great help from Pakistan, but it wasn't successful. Moscow tried to create another path to peace through the so-called Moscow format just before Doha agreement, but also to no avail. Judging by these efforts and current comments from their representatives, they probably wanted Kabul government to include the Taliban, although it's hard to say how they imagined the Taliban's share will be in that government. And that solution could create some kind of more stable situation in Afghanistan. At the same time, both Russia and China feared and criticized US for prolonging military presence in their backyard. So after the fall of Kabul, given US failure, both countries achieved their stated goals. However, the current situation in Afghanistan is not promising at all, and from their perspective can be described in one sentence. Be careful what we wish for, because you might just get it. As we can see, some of the fear from recent developments in Russia's behavior. Even before the fall of Kabul and shortly after it, they held military exercises with Central Asian republics, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. Their goal was to counter potential penetration from radical groups crossing the border. This shows that Russia is preparing for the worst case scenario and also is trying to hold its Central Asian allies together, assuring them of Moscow support. So it seems that for Russia, the main goal to achieve in Afghanistan is to maintain stable security situation, which won't affect its northern neighbors. From Polish point of view, some kind of controlled instability could be also useful for Moscow, just enough to keep Central Asian republics close. Russia will also probably actively will also try to diplomatically be active, but doesn't have the financial resources to affect the situation more significantly. Like China, they adopted the approach to pressure Western governments especially United States, to release the Afghan reserves and relieve some sanctions blocking foreign aid. In their point of view, it is the West which is responsible for the whole situation, so they should be more active. They will not be, both Russia and China will not be hasty with the recognition of the Taliban government, waiting for the situation in Afghanistan to unfold and see if the Taliban can handle the problems they are facing. Although they will maintain cordial relations with the Taliban, but one can expect that once they can't fulfill their promises, Moscow could turn to the former Afghan warlords and politicians currently staying outside the country to pressure Kabul. As for China, the main goal of Beijing is also to maintain stable security situation. China's position in the region differs significantly from the 90s, when the Taliban were in power. This time it has many economic interests in the countries bordering Afghanistan, Central Asian republics and Pakistan, and fears of potential spillover from Afghanistan. The Uyghur problem in Afghanistan is probably the most often mentioned by them in their comments, but it seems that it is greatly exaggerated. Given the fact that official border between Afghanistan and China is very hard to cross, it seems that the movement, the cross-border movement of terrorists, Uyghur terrorists, seems very unlikely. Other groups active in Afghanistan are much greater threat to China interests than Uyghurs. For example, the Pakistani Taliban or Baluch separatists present in Afghanistan have a history of attacking Chinese targets in Pakistan. In the future, the same can be said about radical Uzbeks and Tajik groups that could threaten Chinese investment in Central Asia. This threat will depend on the Taliban's ability to mitigate it. Right now, they are promising that such attack won't happen. So for the new Kabul government, in the next few months or years will be a test, and the answer to the question if they can fulfill their promises. If they can deliver Chinese-Afghan relations could enter the new phase, economic cooperation. Chinese firms will be very interested in extracting resources that are in Afghanistan. This could create a great opportunity for Afghanistan to stand on its feet, but at this point it seems like a distant mirage. There will be many conditions to be fulfilled, and current situation in Afghanistan is going to get worse in the next year or two, so these goals could be not achieved even in the long term. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lesinski, for your remarks. I particularly like that term that you used. Insofar as Russia is concerned, they'd like to see controlled instability, just enough to keep the Central Asians on edge and in the sort of Russian camp and dependent on them. But the bit about Uyghurs, I could not agree with you more. Uyghurs would find it very difficult today to find any kind of perch in Afghanistan, for the Taliban are most likely to cooperate with the Chinese. And at the other end, in Fatah, in any case, the Pakistanis have shown that they would do China's bidding to hunt down the Uyghurs and hand them over to the Chinese. But insofar as other groups are concerned, I think you very rightly brought out the distinct possibility of their creating some bases there and troubling others in the region. May I at this stage request our own colleague here, Dr. Ashok K. Behuria, a senior fellow at the Institute, to kindly step in as a discussant. Ashok Behuria, Dr. Behuria is a senior fellow and coordinator of the South Asia Center. And he too, like Mr. Vishal Chandra, has been with the Institute since 2003. He is also in the editorial boards of the Journal of Peace Studies and Strategic Analysis, which is MP-IDSA's flagship journal, of which I am the chief editor. He's also taught at Delhi University. So I think he brings a good mix of research and academia together. He was at the Jamia Millia as well. But I think above all, the point to mention here is he's got a book to his credit recently. That's Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. So I think we should also look to promote your book soon. Dr. Behuria, the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes, exactly 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the introduction, gracious introduction. I think at this stage, I do not have much to add, but I must, since the 10 minutes are allotted to me, I must make my remarks as well. In fact, I will begin by saying that both Vishal and Dr. Lejinsky dwelt on the theme very well, and they were equally pessimistic about the situation in Afghanistan. I'm also equally pessimistic, like them. But one must understand how things panned out during the last 20 years. In fact, we cannot entirely blame the Afghans for what has come about today. We have to partially blame ourselves. In fact, we can partially attribute it to our complacency, our absent-mindedness, and our over-reliance on the Americans. But we thought that the Americans are at the helm and they will ensure democracy and peace for people of Afghanistan. That was not to be. In fact, they identified the root cause pretty well, and I think well in advance. By 2004, 2003, they had identified that Pakistan was running with the hare and hunting with the hounds. And many American generals used to come out and say in so many words that, here we have a problem. So Pakistan kept feeding and nurturing the Taliban at our expense, even when it was very much part of the global war on terror. In fact, many would tell me that, many Americans would tell me that Pakistan holds the key to peace and stability in Afghanistan. Well, my Pakistani friends would tell me otherwise, that it indeed had the key, but it had thrown it to the Arabian Sea and never to find it again. So the problem is, today the situation is such that even Pakistan cannot by itself put it all together. The jigsaw is in such a bad shape at the moment. The puzzle is in such a bad shape at the moment. I think Dr. Lejinsky pointed out very well, the way the sanctions and the economic situation declining very fast, and that is why the situation is going to worsen. And Russians are also telling us, and the Chinese are also really telling us the same thing, that in Pakistan is all the time that international community has to come in and assist Taliban so that they can so that Afghanistan can be rescued. But the problem here is, I often now till August 15th, we were hearing the people, we were telling people that Afghanistan should have an Afghan-owned, Afghan-controlled, Afghan-driven peace process. Today, the new cry has been inclusive governance, inclusive government. Taliban have not paid enough attention to it. We have only one Hazara, one Tajik, and one Uzbek in the ministry, and the major portfolios have been hijacked by the Haqqanis, who are sleeping with Al-Qaeda all the time. And one would also not be remiss to say that it will not be remiss to say that they are also have part of the Haqqani group is also having some nexus with ISK, whether you believe it or not. Because I find the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, which is all the while whining and dining with Haqqani group and Al-Qaeda, there are elements within the TTP who are with ISK. Until yesterday, they were running a journal called Nawai-e-Afghan-e-Jihad. From 2020, they have come out with Nawai-Afghan, Nawai-Gajwa-e-Hind. So their focus has shifted from Afghanistan to India. So they are now looking at globalizing this terror. so that they can get into India, they can get into Pakistan, they can get into other Central Asian states and bring Islam there as well. In fact, Taliban's return has emboldened these elements all over the place. And this is something that will continue to threaten internal security situation in the neighboring countries. But in my opinion, the major problem Afghanistan faces is the lack of regional consensus on what should be the future of Afghanistan. We all say that inclusive Afghanistan, but we do not actually find a way of how to make Taliban do our bidding. They are not going to listen to us at the moment. They think that the Uzbeks and the Hazaras and the Tajiks are not reliable. In fact, in the previous administration, if you find most of the posts and the jobs were taken in by the Tajiks. Tajiks were in the driver's seat for some time. So many of them have left the country, but many of them are still there. So in order to ensure that the Afghanistan sets up as a normal country, it is imperative that all the ethnic groups should come together, and they should have their say in the power structure. That is not going to happen. And if that is not going to happen, the international community is not going to come out with its aid and assistance. And if that doesn't happen, then the ISK-like elements are going to come to the fore, because in that geographical space you find a competitive radicalism at work. All these groups are trying to prove that they are more Islamic than the rest, and ISK is one of its kind. ISK has come out and said that in fact most of the cadres that ISK has are coming from Taliban ranks, and they are the ones who are now saying that we want to make it even more Islamic. So this competitive radicalism is going to take Afghanistan even down. So who should be blamed for all this? Did Americans live in a hurry, or should they have tarried longer? Do Chinese and Russians have a more constructive role to play? In fact, during the last 20 years, the Chinese have brought in about $200 million, whereas India is the only regional country which has brought in about more than $2 billion to for Afghan reconstruction and Afghan development. So that has to be mentioned. And having done this, even now the Chinese and the Russians say that they are almost in agreement with Pakistan that India shouldn't have that much of a role. In fact, they admit that India has a role, but they, in fact, out of their own newfound love for Pakistan, they would like India's role to be limited there. So this lack of regional consensus is going to impair the process of normalcy, process of peace building in Afghanistan for days to come. I will conclude by giving you out an anecdote to all of you, because we have been talking about China here. In 2018, I was there in China, and we were made to meet the deputy chief of the PLA. And there were people from Germany, there were people, mostly Europeans, from Germany, from Netherlands, from UK, from France, they were there. So during the meeting, they said, "Do you ask me questions? I will answer." Of course, he didn't know English, so he had to speak in Chinese. So out of curiosity, I asked him that, don't you think, General, it is time for China to be a little more vocal about the need for the Taliban to recognize the legitimate government in Kabul as a legitimate government in Kabul? So he said, "I will give you an answer." Then he went on a spiral. He dwelt on it for about 20 minutes. And at the end of the story, he told me that if you see in 1949, if the PLA would have been ignored, do you think China would have had peace? So we need to recognize, he didn't say we need to recognize Taliban, but he was all the while pointing out that a revolutionary force like Taliban will have to be accommodated. So this is not in 2020 that they came around and said that Taliban should be there. I think from 2015, 2016, they had already thought about it, and so had the Russians. Like Jamil Kabulov had been stating it in 2015, 2014, he was saying this. So there was an attempt at bringing Taliban back in, but the Americans were looking at the Taliban, a punch where Taliban will be there and the elected administration will be there. But that didn't happen. But the most important thing that that we need to focus on today is how to make Taliban accommodate the previous people in the previous government, or people from different ethnic minorities, and also from also a bit of women and representation should be there in the government. If that happens, then I think the international community can come in and help out the Afghans. Until then, I would say that we should adopt both. The mechanism of carrot and stick should continue to make Taliban work. Otherwise, all of us are going to face the after effects of the Taliban consolidating its position in Afghanistan if the Taliban are not made to behave as we think they should. Thank you. I think I will end here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Behuria, and especially for ending on that very ominous note about all of us being affected by what happens next in Afghanistan. There are a number of questions. I would request all panelists to also open up their Q&A box so that they can see these questions. And I'm going to try and summarize some of them. I would like both sides to respond to these. The first one is by Mr. Patrick Kugiel of Poland. He has a question in regard to what Mr. Vishal Chandra said, and he bases this on on his recent visit to Iran, where they've been told that hardliners linked to the Haqqanis have got an upper hand over more moderate members of the Doha group. And do you, Mr. Vishal Chandra, think that these moderates can regain control over the Taliban? What is it that the international community can do to strengthen this moderate group within the Taliban? So that's for you. I will quickly reel out the next few questions and then give you, each one of you, the floor again. A second question, again by Mr. Kugiel, is to the Indian speakers, which means Vishal, either you or Dr. Behuria. This is, should the West restart major development aid programs and unfreeze the foreign assets to help the Taliban stabilize the situation in the country, or should they use it as a leverage, risking the collapse of the state? What's your take? What is the better scenario for India? I dare say the collapse scenario is certainly not good for us. The next question is by Anandita Bhada, which is addressed to Mr. Lesinski. You clearly brought out in your presentation that the Afghan situation will not improve anytime soon. Considering this, what is the extent, to what extent do you see Europe, especially Poland, being affected by illegal drug trafficking, with the Taliban, in fact, possibly encouraging opium production? The next question is by Colonel Deepak Kumar of the IDSA. Again, it's for you or for your colleague, Mr. Deptula, to take that. How will Europe see India's future role in Afghanistan? Vignesh from our institute again refers to opium production. That has been the backbone of the Taliban's economy during its long and sustained war with NATO. And there are reports recently that the Taliban have signed a deal with an Australian pharmaceutical company for a cannabis processing plant, even though the Australians have denied these reports. Is Afghanistan at risk of turning into a narco state in South Asia? If so, what would be the impact for the region? So this is not just about Poland being affected by drugs, but about the region at large. You can all comment on each of these, frankly, but please do focus on the ones that are directly targeted at you. Mr. Dinesh Pathak says that Afghanistan is all about the return of the Islamic Emirate under the radicals of the Taliban, with a total involvement and backing of Pakistan. How do you read the Sino-Pak alliance in this context? Essentially, the contradiction that we see in a communist state, coming together with a fundamentalist regime in the context of Afghanistan. I mean, technically, he's pointing to the anathema of Marxism coexisting with an Islamic state, right? And what do we have here now? Mr. Pradeep Reddy Tangirala. The question is, can India risk considering Haqqani network as a mediator to minimize the infiltration in Kashmir? I mean, that's like putting the fox in charge of the chicken pen. The answer is self-evident. I would say no. How can you use the Haqqani? They are the perpetrators. How would they stand as mediators there? They're the worst of the lot in the Taliban. So, but anyway, you can take that question. He wants them to act as a medium between China and the ETIM, between the TTP and Pakistan. I think that question should be taken by Dr. Behuria. And then Prashant Singh of the Institute has two questions. Does Poland have any presence of Tibetan and Uyghur activists in the country? What is the level of Polish civil society interaction with them? Has Poland received any pressure from China in regard to presence and activities by Tibetans or Uyghurs? Dr. Gulbin Sultana, also from our institute, addressed to you, Mr. Lesinski, would like to know the Polish perspective on China's role in Afghanistan. Anyway, there's still some more, gosh. Prashant, you asked several questions. I hope it's not. Okay, Jason Walang from our institute, again to Mr. Lesinski. How do Europe and Russia see Central Asian states like Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan trying to develop closer relations with the Taliban? So there you have all these questions. It's a panoply of issues that they've raised. And I would like to, in fact, throw the floor open, beginning with Mr. Vishal Chandra, to take on the ones that were specifically addressed to you and maybe comment on something else that was also posed to others at large. So I'll run through the panel before we come to the end of this session. Say a quick 3 minutes or so. Vishal, the floor is yours. Please unmute yourself. Vishal, please do unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'll try and combine the two questions here. One is about moderates regaining control over Taliban, and the second is about China and Taliban, Marxism coexisting with Islamic State. Well, as I said earlier, Taliban, obviously, we all know it's not a monolith. I mean, there are various groups within the Taliban now, and as they have expanded, different groups have different notions, different understanding about the Islamic rule, and they have different interpretations, and that is precisely why Taliban have different policies in different parts of Afghanistan. So on the one hand, they're allowing Afghan girls in some provinces to go to the schools, but they're not allowing them mainly in southern eastern parts of the country to go to schools or colleges. Similarly, they're allowing women in certain sectors to attend offices, especially in cities, but not in the villages again. So Taliban will continue to present a very contradictory picture. They will continue to contradict themselves, as is evident from their various statements. The most recent being that they have already formed an inclusive government. So an inclusive government to Taliban means a government that represents the various groups within the Taliban to begin with, including, of course, Haqqanis playing a dominant role, but then there are certain sections of Taliban which were not perhaps represented adequately. So to them, inclusive means representation to various sections of Taliban. Inclusive means getting members from the previous government. I'm not talking of the political leaders. I'm talking of some bureaucrats, some low-level officials to help them in running the day-to-day bureaucracy. But they're certainly not going to have elements from the previous set of leaders to join the government. And let me try and connect it with this idea of China and Taliban coexisting Marxism. And well, as I said, it shouldn't come as a surprise that the people of Afghanistan, the people belonging to different ethnicities or speaking different languages or following different Islamic sects or schools of thought are not at the center of the Taliban thought process, because people's will or choices, they do not matter. Their aspirations matter only to the point where it reinforces their ideology and thereby the idea of an emirate, and perhaps the same could be said for China. So people are considered in such authoritarian setups, they're considered ideologically, let's say they're considered intellectually, let's say, incapable or cognitively challenged to judge what is right or what is best for them or the society and the country. And in case of Taliban, again, for lack of proper understanding of religion or religious scriptures, so Taliban think that people again are not, people need to be told, taught, and if required, forcibly and harshly imposed, their ideology in the name of bringing peace and social order, and putting peace and social order within single quotes here, which is possible only by establishing a strict, pure, genuine Islamic rule. So authoritarian setups find it easier to work with each other. And Taliban, what they have done again, they, as I said, they are looking for a very transactional relationship, and which suits any authoritarian regime. So China says, well, we don't want to interfere in your affairs. You don't let ETIM interfere in our affairs. Though ETIM is not a threat to China. I mean, the strength of ETIM is hardly a couple of hundreds. And as very rightly pointed out by Mr. Lesinski, the threat to BRI or its flagship projects is more from Pakistan-based and maybe from some Central Asian militant groups who were earlier involved, including Uzbek groups who were earlier involved in attacks on Chinese and Pakistani assets. So I think, instead of comparing this whole idea of having Marxism, whether the Marxism and the Islamic authoritarian Islamic regimes can work or not, I think there's a whole history to it, China working with such regimes. And very quickly, whether moderates, I think that might have been possible had serious efforts been made at least a decade ago, when Obama administration decided to have a surge of troops followed by a timetable withdrawal of American forces. I think they missed the opportunity 10 to 12 years back. And if you remember, and I'm sure most of you would, how Mullah Baradar, who headed the negotiating team 2018 onwards and is now a first deputy prime minister, was arrested from Karachi by Pakistani US special forces for reaching out to the Karzai administration. I mean, there's a tribal dimension to it. Both Karzai, Hamid Karzai and Mullah Baradar, they probably came from the same Popalzai tribe. So the tribal networks at that time were very much, at work trying to wean away sections of Taliban at that point of time. But for now, Haqqanis have an upper hand, and they have the right to appoint governors, police chiefs to all the provinces in Afghanistan. And as part of a compromise, 2016 onwards, Haqqanis definitely will continue to exercise strong influence in the eastern half of Afghanistan, with Mullah Yaqub, Mullah Omar's son, sharing influence on the western and maybe parts of southern Afghanistan. So if it comes to strengthening the relatively moderate lot, basically the Doha-based leadership, which held out promises of forming an inclusive government, of protecting the rights of women, or announcing amnesty for members of the Afghan forces or the members of the previous regime. That would require, very quickly, sir, that would require an understanding at a broader regional level, which I'm not ruling out, but certainly not, it's unforeseeable at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Vishal. Very helpful remarks. I know you, obviously have a lot more to say, but the constraints of time, prevent us from sort of dwelling on this any further. May I now turn to Mr. Lesinski at this stage, and you may take questions that were addressed to you, plus any other comments that you wish to make.
course. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I will start with the answer to the shortest answer to the question regarding Tibetan and Uyghur organizations in Poland. I don't know what is their presence. What is their presence in Poland? But as I remember, in the past, the slogan "Free Tibet" was very popular in Poland, and each year there were demonstrations. There were demonstrations next to the Chinese embassy to free Tibet, but it was many years ago, and I don't know if it's still being organized. As far as drug production and potential and Afghanistan potentially becoming drug narco states of South Asia, I think that with the Taliban in power, the situations won't change much. It is not because the Taliban are in power, but because the situation in Afghanistan is right now, economic situation is right now in such a state that that it will affect potential drug production. So I mentioned a few factors that will affect drug prices. For example, labor, cost of labors. Another one was excuse me. It doesn't matter. Anyway, it could also. This is for Europe. This is a threat because
questions. It was about how Europe sees the role of India. Wasn't it that?
I will finish the question about the drug, and I will.
And there was a third one for you. You know, how do Europe and Russia see Central Asian states like Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan developing closer ties with the Taliban?
Yeah, of course.
India's role in Afghanistan. These are some of the.
Okay. So I think there's a strong threat that with drug prices coming down, the Europe will be flooded with the cheap drugs. So this could affect, of course, the situation in Europe. Regarding the next questions about how Russia sees Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan and engagement with the Taliban, I think each Central Asian state chooses its own way regarding the Taliban, because Tajikistan chose another path and it's definitely against the current Taliban regime, and it's probably supporting resistance inside Afghanistan, although it is rather small right now at this point. But I think that Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan chose another path because they think that this is in their own interest, that they can take much more from this kind of relations. We will see which way is better. I don't know, because the situation in Afghanistan is still in flux. So we will see. Another question was
the role of India in Afghanistan. How would you like to see India in Afghanistan? And also, how do you see China's role in Afghanistan?
I mentioned China's role in Afghanistan and in my speech, and I think I will stick to the thoughts that I made over then, because I think that the next few years.
Would you like to see them doing more in Afghanistan? Would you like the Belt and Road to come into Afghanistan, be extended there? Would you like them to come and mop up all the raw materials?
I wish them good luck, of course, because all this investment could take out Afghanistan from the current situation. But what will happen? I don't think that in the next year or two the economic situation, the security situation will allow China to invest or go with Belt and Road investments inside Afghanistan. Yeah.
All right. So at this stage, let me thank you for your clarifications and remarks, and lest Dr. Behuria thought that he could slip away quite easily. No, you will not be allowed to slip away. So you may also kindly comment on all that has been said and any particular question that you think you are best placed to address.
No, I think I have only two observations to make. One about the different groups within Taliban. So far, I see that the groups have been accommodated well as far as the power structure, power sharing is concerned. I distinctly see there are three different groups. One, Habitullah Akhundzadeh and people who follow him. Then you have Mullah Baradar and his followers, and you have the Haqqani group. These three main groups. Yaqub and Mullah Amar's brother, they come between Habitullah and I would say Baradar, somewhere between them. But these all these groups have been well represented in the new government. So that will keep Taliban united. So they have no problem perhaps at the moment from within Taliban. But they will continue to face this threat from outside, ISK and Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda is also affiliated with this Haqqani group, but there are elements who are with Al Qaeda, but they have their sympathies with ISK. They are also creating problems. So that is one set of observation that I want to make. The second set of observation pertaining to what Director General had asked me to clarify, whether India would like Haqqanis to mediate between them and TTP or Taliban, so that there will be less infiltration. I think this whole question is a non-starter, in the sense that Director General pointed out earlier that it is like giving the key to the thief, and I do not think the way they are mediating the differences between China or ETIM or between TTP and Pakistan are of the same, I would say same genre as the differences between India and the terrorists that are trying to attack India, because there the villain is the Pakistani intelligence. They are the ones who are trying to sneak them in. They're trying to infiltrate them into India. So there, I don't think Haqqani will be able to play any role, and India has perhaps no. It has not thought about ever talking to Haqqanis for this kind of help. So that is there. And the third thing that I will conclude by saying that as we are watching this situation deteriorate. In fact, I will still continue to emphasize the need for the evolution of a regional consensus. In fact, we should work towards a regional consensus, which is absent. We have troikas, but we have too many troikas out there. We have US, Russia, US, China, Pakistan. Then you have Russia, Iran, Pakistan. Then and these troikas are exclusive. Because of differences between US and Russia, US and Iran, these troikas also do not work. So until and unless we have this some kind of a consensus there, our competing interests will keep Afghanistan as troubled as it is today. So there has to be some sense, or some good sense coming into our efforts, so that all these things all the countries can come together and think alike on Afghanistan. But that is not going to happen. And the real world is much more stranger than the world of ideal world that we think is there. It's not an ideal world out there. It's a realistic world out there, and people are competing for their interests, and this is likely to worsen. One silver lining in the cloud now is Pakistan allowing Indians to send aid to Afghanistan. That's a silver lining. But will that silver lining lead to this kind of an end state? This is for all of us to see in future. So I do not have much hope, but as they say, even the darkest cloud has a silver lining. Let us hope that there will be a good beginning, and Afghanistan will return to peace and normalcy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Behuria, and particularly for ending on that optimistic, should I say even quite poetic note. Before I turn to Dr. Swasti Rao to deliver the vote of thanks, may I request my colleague and counterpart, Mr. Thomas Deptula, if he would like to come back on and say a few words. All right. Mr.
Yes,
Deptula,
I was trying to join the discussion, but there were some other matters that stole my attention. So I'm sorry. I believe this is
no problems at all. I just wanted to suggest that if you wish to say a few words by way of conclusion.
No, thank you very much. I would like to thank everyone for participation in this discussion, and I hope we will conduct similar events in the future. Thank you.
Very much. Indeed, we will work together, and we should have more of such interaction, not just on Afghanistan, but on other issues of mutual interest. I think at the end of the day, it's very important for us to deepen our partnership between India and Poland, and with two good, excellent ambassadors there to help us, I think we can do much more. I personally would also like us to do more in the defense sector with regard to participation of Poland in our defense industry. So, yeah, at this stage,
I absolutely agree, and I think our Center for Asian Studies is a great place to. It's a great institution, and I think Dr. Krzysztof Iwanek will be in touch and will help organize future webinars and events.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Swasti Rao has recently joined the institute. She's with us, and she is in the Europe-Eurasia Center. So I may also request our Polish counterparts to note that she will be our point of contact for the future as well. And before she delivers her vote of thanks, I would like to deliver my own little vote of thanks to Dr. Swasti Rao, Dr. Rajorshi Roy, and of course, all the speakers on both sides for having participated. But the formal last word, it is for you, Dr. Swasti Rao. Your vote of thanks, please.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon to our friends in Poland, and good evening to everyone in India. On behalf of the Manohar Parrikar Institute of Defense Studies and Analyses, I extend my vote of thanks to the distinguished speakers, respected ambassadors, panelists, and participants from India and Poland. I'd like to thank Ambassador Chinoy, DG, MP-IDSA, for chairing the event and delivering opening remarks that wonderfully encapsulated the diversifying cooperation between Poland and India. In the same light, we would like to thank Mr. Thomas Deptula, Director of Security Studies, War Studies University, for enriching the map of future cooperation between the two countries amidst significant global happenings. I would like to thank Ambassador Nagma Mohammed Malik for extending the support of Embassy of India in Poland and gracing the event with her very interesting and insightful special remarks. I would also like to thank Ambassador Adam Burakowski for enriching this event with his erudite remarks on the same. We are grateful for your participation at the bilateral dialogue. We truly benefited from your support. Next, I would like to thank the distinguished speakers, Mr. Vishal Chandra and Mr. Lezinski, for their detailed analyses on the emerging security complex in Afghanistan in subsequent perspectives from India and Poland. I'm certain that we all have gained a great deal on a very complicated topic that poses vast security challenges of sorts, ripples of which are today felt worldwide. I'd like to thank the discussant, Dr. Ashok Behuria, for enriching the debate with his remarks. Now a word of gratitude for those behind the scenes for their relentless efforts into planning and executing the event successfully. Dr. Chris Iwanek at the War Studies University, Warsaw. It wouldn't have been possible without your efforts, and likewise for my colleagues Anandata and Jason, who have worked tirelessly alongside the technical support team. Last but not the least, I'd like to thank my colleague, Associate Fellow Dr. Roy, for his patience and guidance to make this program a success. I'd like to conclude on a bright note, hoping that today's bilateral was just a beginning to a more fruitful cooperation between India and Poland in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much, and a round of applause also for the IT team led by Mr. Piyush Singh. So thank you all very much, and hope to see you soon. Take care. Goodbye. Namaste.
Thank you. Goodbye.